The harbor was silent, except for the echo of frustration. A massive warship, once the pride of the fleet, now sat crippled, its engines dead, its systems failing. Technicians swarmed across its decks, tools clattering, voices raised, yet nothing worked. Time was running out. If the ship didn't sail, an entire operation, an entire mission, would collapse. The Admiral stood on the pier, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the steel giant before him. He had already called every expert, every mechanic, every engineer. All had tried. All had failed. And now, whispers began to spread, the ship is finished. But the Admiral refused to accept defeat. He reached for a phone and made a call. One name spoken with weight. A name that carried both respect and silence. A legendary veteran. A man long retired, whose battlefield courage and soldier sacrifice had once saved lives countless times. Forgotten by many, remembered by few. When that veteran stepped onto the deck, grease-stained hands brushing the cold steel, everyone stopped. For the first time, the ship wasn't just a machine. It was family, and he had come home. The sea that morning was calm, but the harbor felt heavy with silence. The ship loomed like a wounded giant, its steel hull towering over the pier, yet powerless, lifeless. She was not just any vessel. She had been through storms, wars, and missions that tested the very limits of human endurance. Sailors once called her the heartbeat of the fleet. Now, her decks groaned under the weight of failure. Technicians worked day and night, crawling into narrow engine compartments, checking circuit boards, running diagnostics. Sparks flashed, tools clattered, sweat dripped onto the steel floor. But the more they worked, the worse it seemed to get. Every test ended the same way: silence. Systems that should have roared to life gave nothing but a dull hum, a mocking reminder that their knowledge wasn't enough. The Admiral watched it all unfold. He was a man who had commanded thousands, a leader who had faced storms both on the ocean and in battle. But here, on the pier, he stood powerless. Every expert he had called in, the best engineers, the brightest minds, the most seasoned technicians, had failed. And time was not on their side. The ship was scheduled for deployment. A mission critical to national security depended on her. Intelligence reports had warned of escalating threats in distant waters. The fleet needed her speed, her firepower, her presence. Without her, allies would be exposed, and enemies emboldened. Failure was not an option, but failure was exactly what seemed inevitable. Inside the ship, morale had crumbled. Sailors whispered in the mess hall, their voices carrying the unease no one wanted to admit openly. Some said the ship had reached the end of her life. Others believed she was cursed, doomed to rest in the harbor forever. But the truth was simple. Nobody knew how to fix her. One young technician, barely in his 20s, slammed his wrench down in frustration. "This is impossible," he muttered. "We've tried everything. She's done." His supervisor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ships like this, they don't just die. They need someone who knows how to listen, not just to the machines, but to their history." But those words felt hollow. History wasn't going to restart the engines. History wasn't going to meet the deadline. The Admiral paced the pier, his boots echoing against the concrete. His officers kept their distance, sensing the storm in his silence. Finally, one of his captains approached. "Sir, we've exhausted every option. Perhaps it's time to accept." "Accept?" The Admiral's voice cut through the air like steel. His eyes burned. "You think I'll accept leaving that ship here, letting her rot, when men bled and died under her flag? When she's carried the weight of freedom across oceans?" He paused, his voice lowering, but still firm. "No, not while I'm still in command." That night, long after the harbor lights flickered on, the Admiral stood alone on the pier. The ship's shadow stretched across the water, broken and silent. He thought of the men and women who had served aboard her, sailors who had trusted her engines, who had fought under her guns. He thought of the word service, something machines couldn't truly understand, but veterans did. And then it struck him. There was one man, One man who had once been called the soul of the engineering corps. A veteran whose name was spoken with reverence in the old days. He had retired years ago, slipping into the quiet life of forgotten heroes. Few remembered him now, but those who did never forgot what he was capable of. His battlefield courage hadn't been shown with a rifle, but with grease-stained hands and unshakable resolve. He could hear a failing engine and know its pain the way a surgeon reads a heartbeat. The Admiral hesitated only for a moment before reaching for the phone. It was a call heavy with pride, but also with humility. To call a man back from the shadows of retirement meant admitting that no one else could do what he once did. "Get me his number," the Admiral said. The line rang, and when the voice finally answered, it was calm, steady, weathered by time. The Admiral spoke the situation plainly, with no embellishments. The silence on the other end stretched long enough to feel like an eternity. And then came the answer. "I'll come." The Admiral closed his eyes, a weight lifting from his chest. He knew then that hope had returned. Not in the form of more machines or more tools, but in the form of one man, one real war hero whose name had nearly been forgotten. When dawn broke, the harbor was alive with whispers. Word had spread quickly. A legendary veteran was on his way. Technicians paused their work, unsure what to expect. Some scoffed, doubting what an old man could do that they hadn't already tried. Others felt a flicker of anticipation, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, they were about to witness something extraordinary. And when he finally arrived, dressed not in uniform, but in simple clothes, his posture straight despite his years, every eye turned. His hands bore the marks of decades of soldier sacrifice, calloused from engines, hardened by war. He said nothing at first. He simply walked onto the deck, placed his hand on the cold steel of the ship, and closed his eyes. The ship, silent for weeks, seemed to breathe again. The deck of the ship was crowded that morning. Sailors, technicians, and officers gathered in quiet circles, their conversations hushed, their eyes drifting to the figure who had just boarded. He didn't look like much to the younger men, just an older veteran in worn clothes, his hair silvered by time, his step steady but deliberate. Yet those who knew his story stood straighter in his presence. They understood that this was not just any man. The Admiral met him halfway down the deck. "Thank you for coming," he said firmly, though beneath his words was the weight of desperation. The veteran gave a small nod. "Ships don't die," he murmured, his voice rough but calm. "They just wait for someone to listen." He didn't ask for orders. He didn't need instructions. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, running his hand across the steel bulkheads, the railings, even the deck plates. It was as if he were greeting an old friend. To him, this crippled ship wasn't just machinery. It was a living memory of sacrifice, courage, and service. The technicians exchanged doubtful glances. Some smirked, others shook their heads. One whispered, "He's going to fix this ship by touching it." But the Admiral silenced them with a single glance. The veteran descended into the engine room. The smell of burnt oil and scorched wiring filled the air. Technicians had left tools scattered, manuals opened, diagrams pinned on walls with notes scrawled in frustration. The engines sat in silence, huge, complex, and broken. He crouched beside the massive turbines, closing his eyes for a long moment. The younger men waited, confused. Finally, he spoke. "You've been treating her like a problem to solve," he said. "But you forgot to listen to her story. Machines remember, gentlemen. They carry every scar, every strain, every mistake. You don't repair a ship like this, you heal it." Some rolled their eyes. But when he picked up a wrench, his hands moved with purpose. Every bolt he loosened, every valve he adjusted, was done with confidence born not from manuals, but from decades of lived experience. The Admiral stood silently in the corner, watching. He remembered the stories, how this man had once repaired a failing engine during a storm at sea, saving a destroyer from drifting into enemy fire. How he had patched a power grid in darkness while bombs fell overhead, giving gunners just enough power to defend their ship. Stories that had sounded like legend, but now, seeing him work, the Admiral knew they were real. Hours passed. The veteran barely spoke, except to ask for specific tools in a tone so firm that no one dared delay. He rewired panels, rechecked circuits, and tapped along pipes, listening for the faintest changes in sound. His ears were sharper than the most advanced sensors. At one point, a young technician finally blurted out, "Sir, with respect, we've already checked that line. It's fine." The veteran glanced at him, calm but piercing. "If it were fine, your ship wouldn't be dying." He tapped the line again, listening. Then he cut into it, exposing a hidden fracture deep within the metal, something no scanner had detected. Gasps filled the room. The young man's face flushed, shame mixing with awe. "Machines speak," the veteran said quietly. "You just need to know their language." By nightfall, progress had been made. Systems that had been silent flickered faintly with life. Not much, not enough to power the ship, but enough to prove that hope was real. For the first time in weeks, the ship's heartbeat could almost be heard again. Word spread quickly. Sailors whispered in the mess halls, eyes wide with renewed belief. He found something. The engines stirred. Others simply said, "The veteran's back." The Admiral gathered his officers late that night. Some were skeptical. "He's good," one captain admitted, "but he's only one man. Can he really bring her back?" The Admiral's reply was firm. "He's not just fixing steel. He's restoring her spirit. That's something no manual teaches. And I'd trust him with this ship more than I'd trust any 1,000 technicians." Back in the engine room, the veteran kept working into the night. His body bore the weight of his years, his back ached, his hands trembled faintly when he paused, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had carried him through war. This wasn't about glory or recognition. This was about respect, for the ship, for the sailors who had served on her, for the forgotten heroes whose sacrifices had kept her alive. At one point, a young sailor approached him timidly. "Sir, why did you come back? You don't owe us anything." The veteran looked at the boy, his expression softening. "I owe everything. Men I served with never came home. They gave their lives so ships like this could sail. If I can keep her alive, then their sacrifice still means something. That's why I came." The words sank deep into the sailor's heart. He would remember them for the rest of his life. By the time dawn broke, the ship's engines gave a low, steady rumble, not yet strong enough to sail, but alive. The sound echoed through the steel corridors, waking sailors who rushed to see if it was real. For many, tears filled their eyes. It was not just a machine roaring, it was hope returning. On the pier, the Admiral stood tall, his chest rising with pride. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he also knew one thing for certain. This ship would not die. Not while that veteran still had strength in his hands and fire in his heart. The ship's low rumble echoed through the steel corridors, but it wasn't enough. She was alive, yes, but only barely. The Admiral knew it. The crew knew it. And most of all, the veteran knew it. There was one last obstacle, one final piece that stood between failure and resurrection. The main power relay. It was buried deep in the ship's core, a massive system that connected every part of the vessel. Without it, the engines would never reach full strength, the lights would never burn steady, and the ship would never leave the harbor. But that relay was a nightmare. The technicians had tried for weeks to reach it. The chamber was cramped, the bolts rusted, the wiring complex and unstable. Attempts to repair it had only caused further damage. The space was so tight that most modern equipment couldn't even fit inside. "Sir," one engineer said to the Admiral, "even if we could fix it, it would take days. We don't have days." The Admiral's gaze shifted to the veteran, who was listening silently. His eyes narrowed, studying the schematics pinned on the wall. Finally, he said softly, "Then I'll go in." The room fell silent. "You can't," a technician protested. "That chamber's barely big enough for one man. The heat, the fumes, it's dangerous. It could collapse." The veteran's expression didn't change. "I've been in tighter spots." The Admiral stepped forward. "You don't have to do this." The old man gave a faint smile. "Admiral, with respect, this isn't about what I have to do. It's about what must be done. And with that, he descended once more into the belly of the ship. The crawl space to the relay chamber was narrow, the air hot and stifling. Each step echoed with the weight of years gone by, memories pressing against the walls of his mind. He remembered storms at sea, engines failing in the dark, men shouting for help while he worked with nothing but a flashlight between his teeth. He remembered patching broken systems while shells exploded above deck. This was not new. This was not worse. This was simply another battle. He squeezed through the final hatch and entered the chamber. The heat hit him like a wall. Sweat stung his eyes as he crouched before the massive relay, a beast of wires and steel. He laid his hand on it, feeling its silence, as if it were a fallen soldier waiting for revival. Back in the engine room, sailors crowded around monitors, listening to his voice crackling faintly through a headset. "Talk to me, sir," one of them said nervously. "I'm inside," the veteran replied, his voice steady. "She's in worse shape than I thought." "How bad?" A pause. "Bad enough that if I make a mistake, she'll never wake again. But we'll get it done." Hours passed as he worked. His hands moved with precision, but every motion drained his strength. The bolts were corroded, the wires fused together by years of wear. He cut, rewired, and soldered with the patience of a surgeon. Sparks lit the chamber like flashes of lightning, each one threatening to ignite the fumes lingering in the air. At one point, a technician's voice came urgently through the headset. "Sir, sensors are showing rising pressure in that chamber. It's not safe." The veteran chuckled softly, the sound rough but steady. "Son, I didn't come here to be safe. I came here to finish the fight." The Admiral closed his eyes, listening. Those words carried the weight of every forgotten hero, every unsung story of sacrifice. This wasn't about fixing a ship. It was about honoring the lives that had been lived and lost aboard her. His strength began to falter. His breath came heavier. His hands, steady for hours, began to tremble. He leaned against the bulkhead, sweat dripping, his vision blurring. He thought of the men he had served with decades ago. Their faces, their voices, their laughter. Many of them had never made it home. If I stop now, he thought, their sacrifices mean nothing. If I keep going, their memory sails with this ship. And so, he pushed forward. One last bolt remained, rusted and fused in place. He braced himself, every muscle screaming, and turned with all the strength his body had left. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a screech that echoed through the chamber, the bolt gave way. The relay cracked open. With shaking hands, he replaced the final circuit, sealing it with precision. He whispered to the ship, almost like a prayer, "Come back, old girl. Your fight isn't over yet." In the engine room, the monitors flickered. Lights surged. Then, suddenly, power. Real, steady, surging power. The ship's engines roared, a deep thunder rolling through the steel hull, rattling the decks, echoing across the harbor. Sailors shouted in disbelief, some cheering, some with tears in their eyes. The Admiral's fists clenched as he fought to hold his composure, but his heart swelled with pride. The crippled ship, the heartbeat of the fleet, was alive again. The veteran's voice crackled through the headset, weak but triumphant. "Admiral, she's ready." The Admiral leaned toward the MIC, his voice firm, carrying respect that words could barely contain. "You've done it. You've brought her back." When the veteran finally emerged from the chamber, his clothes were soaked, his face streaked with grease and sweat. He looked exhausted, every step heavy, but his eyes glowed with quiet pride. The sailors who had doubted him now stood at attention, saluting without being told. For them, this was no longer about an old man fixing a machine. This was about witnessing battlefield courage in its purest form, not on a field of war, but in the heart of a crippled ship. The Admiral approached him, his voice low, filled with respect. "You didn't just fix her. You reminded us what service means." The veteran gave a small nod. "I only did what was needed. The real heroes are the ones who never came back." And with those words, the ship's resurrection became not just a triumph of steel, but a living military tribute, a reminder of real war heroes, of forgotten heroes, of the soldier sacrifice that had carried their nation across every ocean. The morning sun rose over the harbor, painting the waves in gold. The crippled ship, once silent and broken, now rumbled with life. Her engines throbbed with steady power, sending vibrations through the pier. Sailors stood at their stations, eyes wide with disbelief and pride. For weeks they had thought this day impossible. Now, the impossible stood before them, alive and ready. The Admiral gave the order. Prepare to take her out. A hush fell over the deck as the massive vessel stirred. Slowly, almost cautiously, she began to move. Lines were cast off. Water churned as her engines pushed, the steel giant sliding away from the pier for the first time in far too long. The sound was not just mechanical, it was emotional, as if the ship herself were breathing deeply again after weeks of suffocation. On the pier, civilians and families gathered, drawn by the sight. Some raised their phones, others simply stood in awe. But on board, no one dared speak. They felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a test run. This was a resurrection. The veteran stood near the engine room hatch, his posture straight despite his exhaustion. He had insisted on staying aboard for her first sail. As the ship's bow turned toward open water, sailors glanced at him with quiet reverence. To them, he was no longer just an old mechanic or forgotten veteran. He was the reason they were moving at all. One young sailor finally approached him. "Sir, the crew would like to honor you." The veteran shook his head. "Honor the ship. She's the one who carries your future." But honor was unavoidable. When the ship cleared the harbor and entered the open sea, the Admiral ordered the crew to muster on deck. Hundreds of sailors lined the rails, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn. The sea breeze whipped against their flags as they turned toward the veteran standing quietly at the center. The Admiral stepped forward, his voice carrying over the deck. "Men and women of this crew, you have witnessed something extraordinary. When hope was gone, when every effort had failed, when we believed this ship would never sail again, one man reminded us what service truly means. He showed us that battlefield courage is not only found under fire, but in sacrifice, in persistence, and in love for something greater than oneself." He turned toward the veteran, his eyes steady but heavy with respect. "Sir, you came when we needed you most. You gave us back our ship. And in doing so, you gave us back our pride." The deck erupted in the sharp crack of hundreds of boots striking steel as the entire crew snapped to attention. In one unified motion, they saluted. The veteran's eyes glistened. He had never asked for recognition, never sought applause. He had only come to do what was needed. Yet in that moment, surrounded by young men and women who could have been his grandchildren, he felt the weight of every friend he had lost, every forgotten hero whose name had faded with time. This salute wasn't for him alone, it was for all of them. He returned the salute, his hand trembling slightly, his voice steady as he spoke. "Carry them with you. Every time this ship sails, every time her engines roar, remember those who gave everything. That's the true tribute." The ship pushed further into the open sea. The roar of her engines grew stronger, the decks vibrating with power, the ocean spray rising high against her hull. She was no longer crippled. She was reborn. Sailors began to cheer, their voices echoing across the waves. For the first time in weeks, laughter and hope filled the air. They were not just crew members. They were guardians of a legacy that had been restored by one man's sacrifice. The Admiral stood beside the veteran as the wind whipped across the bridge. "She's yours again," he said softly. The veteran shook his head. "No, Admiral. She's theirs now. I was only here to remind her who she is." The Admiral studied him for a moment. "You've given them more than a ship. You've given them belief." The veteran didn't reply. He simply looked out at the horizon, the waves stretching endlessly before them. In his eyes was the quiet satisfaction of a man who had carried out his duty one final time. When the ship returned to port later that day, the pier was lined with sailors, families, and civilians who had heard the story. They cheered as the great vessel docked, but the loudest ovation was for the man who had made it possible. The Admiral tried to convince him to accept a ceremony, a medal, some form of official recognition. But the veteran refused. "Medals tarnish," he said simply. "Ships sail. That's all the honor I need." Still, the crew would not let his name fade. They began to tell his story, to new recruits, to their families, to anyone who would listen. He became part of the ship's legacy, his actions woven into the fabric of her history. And though he eventually stepped quietly back into the shadows of retirement, his mark remained. Every time that ship cut across the ocean, every time her engines thundered, those who had been there remembered. She lived because of one man who refused to let her die. In the end, it wasn't about steel or machinery. It was about respect, for sacrifice, for service, for forgotten heroes who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. The crippled ship had been saved, but more importantly, the crew had been reminded of what it truly means to serve. To give your strength, your skill, and sometimes even your life, so that others may carry forward. And so, the story of that veteran became more than just a tale of repair. It became a military tribute, a living reminder that real war heroes are not always the ones who fire weapons or win medals, but sometimes the ones who, with grease-stained hands and unshakable courage, bring life back to what others had already given up on. As the sun set over the harbor, casting the ship in a golden glow, the Admiral spoke quietly to those beside him. "Ships may be built of steel, but they live because of men like him." And somewhere, in the heart of that ship, it felt as if the steel itself agreed.